been a couple weeks since I've last updated you guys. Well, in those past couple weeks, I've been able to shake down the car at the track, quite literally. I was able to get out to Motorsports Ranch Cresson, and I ran the full 3-mile track. It was my first time there, and one thing I've learned was that it was a very, very bumpy track, especially during the transitions from the 1.7-mile track to the 1.3-mile track and vice versa. This shakedown was also a comedy of errors on my part and also on part of the ground control coilover kit. And I'm not bashing it by any means because I did buy a used kit where I didn't know any history behind it. But anyways, let's kind of go over what I learned about the car and how bad it was during that first day out on the track. You guys saw me put the ground control kit on, and it was kind of troublesome because I need to space out the front struts kind of weird just to get the proper ride height. Well, because I had so much preload on those front struts just to get the ride height jacked up, I only had about 3/4 inch of droop. Therefore, upon turn-in, as the body would start to roll and I'm still trail brake, I would lift the inside front tire and it would make the ABS go crazy. I'm also running Hawk ER1 pads, which I've never run before, but I really didn't have any issue with brake application. It was just upon brake release where everything was going crazy, and I do think it was due to not having enough droop and lifting an inside front tire. You can also see how bouncy the car is on track, and that's because of the completely wrong rear end setup that I put on the car. The first thing I did wrong was use a 4.5-inch tall, 1,000-pound rate spring, and that only had about 2.25 inches of travel, and that was definitely not enough for the rear of the E46. I was hitting coil bind constantly, and when that happens, your spring rate goes to infinity, and it just makes for a really horrible time driving. The second issue is that I didn't have long enough bump stops to prevent coil bind. The Coney rear shocks that I had on have a really short bump stop that prevent the shock body from bottoming out on itself. However, I was hitting coil bind much before I was actually hitting the shock bump stop. And lastly, I was just driving on blown rear shocks. When I oscillated the shocks by hand, which isn't a good test, there was still gas pressure, so I wrongly assumed that the shocks were still working. However, I'm sure once you put the shock on the car and oscillate it at the speed that the vehicle's actually traveling at, there's no chance that the shock had any damping force. It is still available. I was actually able to prove that this was true because I put on the stock rear shocks in my next track day, and the car handled perfectly fine even though it was just riding on the soft BMW bump stops. With that said, enjoy some really bouncy and ugly track driving, and me just struggling to get a hold of the car and a new track.